In the space race, not all runners are equal. Space is just basically a new extension of our geography, just like a new continent we got to discover. Navigating to it is extremely challenging, we still don't know much about it and are learning every day, and success in it can be extremely rewarding. You can see space as a new strategic resource, just like oil or electronics. Many key technologies would simply be impossible without it. From fast and secure communications to synchronized worldwide clocks, from climate monitoring to military spying, from tracking the resources on the planet to mining new minerals on the moon, space is just a vital asset. And just like any asset, countries around the world are racing with each other to try and take the biggest share of it. Some of them are playing the big game, some of them are trying to catch up, some are even happy to just participate, and some are just sitting on the bench. The distance between space's frontrunner, the USA, and the other countries challenging its dominance is really much bigger than people realize. To give you an idea, in 2023 statistics, approximately 116 launches were identified as being American. China, the closest competitor following it, was only at 67 launches, close to half the US number. And Russia, the third largest, is only at 20 launches. Obviously, this is still a very significant performance. Most countries in the world don't even launch rockets at all, but still, in comparison to the US, this is not a very high performance. It's also interesting to look at the total number of satellites launched ever. Historically, the American satellites launched are around 4,511 satellites. China is following, but only with 586 satellites, so you can just see how big the difference is. These two are followed by the UK with 561 and Russia with 177 satellites in total. So again, it gives you a scale of the different levels of competition. So on the pure space access aspect of things, the US is really dominating, but that's not the only side of it. The US has also been consistently leading the space exploration race, or the scientific aspect of it. So the milestones coming from NASA on the scientific side are also a long list. The Apollo missions, where astronauts walked on the moon for the very first time and on 6 different occasions, the Hubble Space Telescope in 1990, followed by the James Webb Space Telescope in 2021, multiple Mars orbiters, rovers, probes across the solar system. Anyway, the list is really long and it keeps growing with time. And the competition does exist, but just at a very different scale. And on top of that, in addition to the rockets, the satellites, the scientific missions, the US is also dominating on the human spaceflight side, despite a very strong presence by the Chinese and the Russians. NASA is by far the main player on the International Space Station, and projects like the Space Shuttle or the Dragon capsule by SpaceX definitely maintain it as the key gatekeeper when it comes to human space activity. And despite some budget cuts in 2023 and 2024 on some of the projects, NASA's budget is still very high compared to the past decades. And of course, it's really high compared to the competition as well. So who are NASA's main challengers then? Well, to be clear, it's sometimes a bit difficult to put a real ranking between the countries. Like stuff like the budget or the number of space objects can be a bit misleading if you're only trying to rank the national space programs based on them. But let's at least take a look at the countries that seem to be the most invested and whose progress is really noticeable. As mentioned before, the first options that would come to mind would be Russia, China. Russia has obviously inherited a lot of the USSR technology. It includes a lot of heritage, like the first satellite ever, Sputnik 1, the first human in space, or the first and largest spaceport ever, Baikonur in Kazakhstan, which is still operational today, by the way. These capacities and the work of Roscosmos in general have allowed Russia to keep a really strong position when it comes to space activity. It's also a very strong player on the International Space Station, and in fact until 2020 NASA was dependent on the Russian Soyuz capsule to reach the ISS. But it does seem like China has progressed so much in the past few decades that it ended up passing Russia on the podium. I mean, China is effectively considered to be the main challenger to the US dominance in space right now in most space fields. So human spaceflight, for example, with the Tiangong space station, or the access to space, for example, the number of satellites that we saw earlier, despite a comparable UK performance, but at the same time the number of rockets with the Long March rocket series, or the number of active spaceports that they have scattered all across the country. Even on the space exploration side, for example, China has very good performances with the Chang'e missions to the moon, for example, rovers reaching different spots on the moon and even sending samples back to Earth, or with the Zhurong missions to Mars, which is a performance that very few countries can claim. I mean, do you say Zhurong? Is that the right way to pronounce it? Europe is also a very strong space player. They have access to expertise from France, Germany, Italy and many more, and they not only have independent space access with the Kourou spaceport in South America, which is in French Guiana, French territory there, but also very strong scientific contributions with the Rosetta Philae missions as a very good example. By the way, just to clarify a little bit, a little pause here. So Europe has the European Space Agency, which is like a high-level organization supervising space activity in Europe in general, but many European countries have their own national space agencies, and depending on the project we're talking about, it's either like a cooperation between the National Space Agency and the European Space Agency, or the ESA is basically overheading a program involving many actors at a European scale. Just wanted to clarify this because sometimes people get confused, like where is ESA sitting? Doesn't Germany and France, don't they have their own national space agencies and stuff? Yes, they do, but there are different entities, and depending on the project we're talking about, they interface a bit differently. Of course, Japan, or JAXA, is definitely included in the main pack, and again, the formula is really strong. Independent space access with their own spaceports, a number of rockets that they design and manufacture themselves, a number of space objects, and a number of scientific projects and contributions. Not to mention that they directly contribute to the ISS with a full module, which is a really big role. And last but certainly not least, India is definitely included in the main pack as well. I mean, ISRO saw a really big boost of their activity, especially after the PSLV program in the 90s. Again, the formula is really strong, like independent space access, a number of scientific milestones, the Chandrayaan landing on the moon. I mean, it's a really big player as well. So we saw the front runner, which is the US, completely dominating the field, the main pack following it with all the major space runners, but what about the rest of the world? And obviously, it wouldn't be very useful for me to start listing every single national space program in the world. I mean, Google can take care of that. But if you focus on this a little bit, you will notice two things. First thing is, many national space programs were born around the 80s and 90s in correlation with the Cold War a little bit, but in many cases, they weren't really active. They often served as more political banners than actual, like, scientific space activity. And the second thing you might notice is that in the 21st century, there was a considerable acceleration of some of those national space programs. Not only an acceleration with more space programs being born, but also an acceleration in the ambitions of the previously present national space programs that were a bit like passive in the past decades. And the targets can vary quite a lot from one country to the other, but the remaining constant is that direct access to space, independent access to space, is always the really hard part. Even the most serious new space players often focus on satellite ownership rather than rocket launching, and this is very easy to understand when you start realizing how difficult it is to launch rockets to space in a safe way. I mean, this goes from obviously the difficulty of the rocket equation itself and getting it right, but it also comes sometimes from purely geographic constraints. If you want to locate your spaceport a specific way and be able to launch without risking populations, sometimes geography is not really helping you. I'll try to dedicate a future video, by the way, to what makes it so difficult for new space players to start launching their own rockets. Generally though, the priority is often given to space data usage and securing like a strategic space infrastructure for yourself. The priority is often given to military projects and potentially university level projects. So military are often taking the priority, obviously for like strategic reasons. And on the civilian side, starting a project related to space at university scale is often a good way of like starting to discover that space topic on the civilian side without investing too much in it. I can mention South Africa, for example, with their national space program around 2010, if I'm not wrong. And basically the focus is to try and develop the use of space data and services at a local level. So basically they want to develop their own satellite manufacturing capacity and use this capacity at a national scale. Larger projects, however, can go all the way from building your own space data infrastructure for, I don't know, agricultural imagery, for example, all the way to a completely independent telecommunications network. But this does not come cheap. It's a lot of work and a lot of investment, and it also takes a lot of time to mature. And of course, certain countries are not really investing in the infrastructure per se, but they prefer to invest in scientific projects. It's often for political considerations when you think about it. I mean, financially speaking, it's rarely interesting, and it doesn't really help with the fundamental infrastructure, but it helps when it comes to communication or to enhance cooperations with other countries. The UAE is a very good example of that with the Moon and Mars missions, for example. So those missions, when you think about it, don't necessarily come from a deep scientific development. They are not particularly particularly interesting financially speaking, but they are a great occasion to communicate on your scientific focus, and are also really serious cooperations happening with the US and NASA in general, which is definitely beneficial from a political perspective. So we looked at the big players, we looked at the challengers trying to make a name for themselves, but when you think about it, the number of countries we're talking about is not big. I mean, across the globe there are 195 countries, something like that, and only 78 of them have national space programs that are officially declared. So where are the others? As we said in the beginning, space is not really optional anymore when you think about it. It's a very important and strategic piece of infrastructure that you need to invest in, but many countries are often very poorly invested in the space race overall. The reasons for that lack of interest can be multiple. I mean, it can be economical, it can be technical, it can be political if, for example, you're passing through a very deep political crisis, or if you're dependent on other partners with specific sets of technology. But as with any vital asset or strategic asset, not investing in the space infrastructure has a long-term risk to it. You can become politically dependent on another country completely if you're relying on them to access this vital asset called space. You can also be blind to the expansion of some of your rivals and the threat that that could pose to you. You can miss significant economic opportunities when you think about it, related to space data or to space resources if you talk about the mining topic. And you can definitely also dig the gap, the technological gap between you and all of the rest of the world if you're not pursuing research on the topic right now. So space is not only growing as an independent industry, it's also a key industry, a pillar for many other key industries and resources. So ship navigation, resources digging, military capacity. Overall, if you don't pursue a space capacity right now, you're actually losing capacity on many other fronts that you potentially don't see yet. Anyway, I hope you learned something new today. Again, let me know in the comments if you have other questions, what you think of the videos, if you have specific topics that you want to see a video about. I have a long list of topics that I want to cover, but I'm always open to new ideas. And if you like the content, subscribe to the channel. I have to take off now. See ya.